Hello everyone! During the last week or so I decided to start reading through the Walking Dead comics once again from the beginning. Whilst reading I was surprised by just how much I had forgotten of the comics, which is completely different to the TV show. So with that in mind I've decided to make a video detailing 5 crazy The Walking Dead comic book moments that never made it over to TV. This video primarily focuses on issues number 1 to 48 of the comics, so that's everything from Rick waking up from his coma to the fall of the prison. So if you don't want to hear any other comic book spoilers, then please stop watching now. And with that out of the way, let's get straight into it. The only two things that the TV version and the comic book version of Tyreese share are the same name and the same love of hammers as a melee weapon. Apart from that, they are fundamentally different characters. Whereas TV Tyreese was introduced during the prison arc, the comic book version ran into Rick and his group much earlier, whilst they were on the road after they decided to leave the Atlanta campsite. Tyreese quickly went on to become one of Rick's closest allies and a valuable member of the group before his death at the hands, or should I say hand, of the governor. One of the most shocking storylines that occurred during his comic book run was the death of his daughter Judith, who was shot in the head by her boyfriend Chris. It's clear from the first time we see the two getting together that Tyreese does not approve of their relationship, and the two young lovers decide to form a suicide pact so they can be together forever. Whether this was down to knowing Tyreese did not want them to be together or due to their mental state caused by the world around them is open for debate. After having a barn full of walkers escape on Herschel's farm, Tyreese told Chris and Judy to hold onto their firearms which they both previously used at shooting practice in order to better protect themselves, something he would regret dearly later down the line. When the group reaches the prison, the couple have sex with one another before deciding to go through their plan of shooting each other at the exact same time. However, Chris pulls the trigger too soon, which causes Judy to die and him to remain alive. Tyreese arrives shortly after and, as one would expect, completely loses it. He strangles Chris to death as Rick quietly watches on in the background. Tyreese remarks that he's then going to wait for Chris to turn so he can kill him once again, but this time slower. Both the suicide attempt and Tyreese's revenge are incredibly dark and disturbing to read. Admittedly, you can't really blame a man for murdering someone who killed his daughter, but it still doesn't make seeing a guy choke a kid to death any more easier to digest. A lot of extremely messed up shit happened during the prison arc in the comics that didn't make the cut to TV, and the decapitation of 2 children by a prisoner named Thomas is another example. Much like the TV show, when entering the prison, Rick stumbles across some inmates in the cafeteria who have been holed up inside since the beginning of the outbreak. When the prisoners introduce themselves to Rick, they all openly state what crimes they're in for, except Thomas. Thomas simply says that he's in prison for tax fraud, but that's not his fault, which to me immediately seems suspect. Whilst looking around the prison, Maggie and Glenn stumble across a room that was used as a hairdressing facility for the inmates. Once inside, they both decide to get a new fresh trim. This piques the curiosity of Maggie's 2 younger twin sisters, Susie and Rachel, who want to know where this amateur barber shop is, to which Maggie responds by pointing them in the right direction. After being gone for a couple of hours, Herschel decides it's time to check up on his 2 little girls. When the old Bible basher does eventually find the location of the hair salon, he opens the door to a complete horror scene, as he gazes upon the sickening view of his 2 girls' heads severed and separated from their bodies. If that isn't enough to make your stomachs turn, the 2 heads then start moaning and groaning, which just makes the whole thing even more messed up. An inmate called Dexter was then wrongly accused of the crime due to his murderous background, which allowed Thomas to remain at large and also nearly kill Andrea. Thankfully, Andrea fought off the knife-wielding maniac before escaping outside, which allowed Rick to beat the crap out of him. Rick did plan to hang Thomas in order to make an example out of him, but stupid Patricia tried to help him escape, wanting to save his life. Thankfully, he didn't manage to get very far though, as Maggie burst out of her cell next door to him and shot him through the stomach, killing the tax dodger once and for all. I know that we have had some kids die on the TV show. There was the don't look at the flowers scene and the moment when Sam got eaten by a ton of walkers, but for me this is more messed up than both of these examples. The sheer shock of turning the page and seeing 2 kids' bodies with their heads chopped off is not something I'll forget. Truth be told, I can see why this moment didn't make it to TV, and that's probably not the only time I'm going to say that whilst doing this list. Like the previously mentioned Tyreese, the comic book version of Carol is nothing like the TV show version. Whilst I actually prefer Tyreese on paper, I much prefer Melissa McBride's badass Carol than the unhinged one that features in the comics. In all honesty, comic Carol is pretty damn weird, and is someone who needs to be given constant attention. She hates to be alone, which causes her to latch onto anyone who even gives her the slightest bit of acknowledgement. She tries it on with Rick when it's clear that he's blatantly not interested. She then tries it on with Laurie and proposes the idea of a three-way relationship between the two of them and Rick, and even asks Laurie if she can marry the both of them. Clearly freaked out by this, Laurie tells her to get lost, which causes her to become even more of a loner. Not long after these failed attempts, she decides to seduce Herschel's 19-year-old son Billy, and the two have a good old shag. After having her pussy ploughed, Carol ventures out into the prison yard, where she begins pouring her heart out to a walker who's been tied up for research purposes. Carol goes on to say that no one likes her and that the walker is her only friend. She then leans into the walker, allowing it to bite her neck, before saying, "Oh, you do really like me," which is really messed up. Now, I imagine getting bit in the neck by a walker would hurt a hell of a lot, but from my interpretation of the illustration, it doesn't look like Carol is in pain. Rather, it looks like she's enjoying it. Mentally, Carol is so far gone at this point that in her head she equates a walker eating her to someone giving her affection, causing me to believe that she actually enjoyed dying, which is bloody strange to say the least. This moment kind of reminds me of the psychopath Adam the Clown in the first Dead Rising game. A guy who actually laughs and giggles when he's chainsawed to death, something that is equally as unpleasant to view. Carol might not have been one of the greatest characters in the comics, but her death sure was one of the most memorable. So I'll get this out of the way first. I actually quite like the TV show version of the Governor. Whilst Comic Gov was plain psycho, I feel like the TV version had lots more depth to him and was more interesting to watch. However, as a result of AMC toning the Governor down for the TV audience, it not only meant viewers missed out on a real Michonne and Governor rivalry, but also two of the most disgusting scenes in the comics, which depending on your opinion may be a good or a bad thing. When Rick, Glenn and Michonne first encounter the Governor, the crazy bastard chops Rick's hand off after telling him he's going to feed them to the walkers which they use for their arena fights. Michonne goes absolutely mental after this happens and jumps onto the Governor and goes full Mike Tyson, biting his ear off. The Governor then responds by doing a Mike Tyson impression of his own by raping and beating Michonne and keeping her as a sex slave in one of his cells. He even comments that he's going to rape her until she finds a way to kill herself, which just goes to show what a nasty piece of work he really is. Long story short, Michonne manages to escape with Rick's help, but instead of leaving Woodbury, decides to find the Governor and get revenge. What I'm about to tell you will make the Governor and Michonne fight that takes place in the TV show seem like child's play. So like in the TV show, Michonne manages to find her way to the Governor's apartment, whereby the two have a struggle. Michonne manages to get the upper hand and knocks him out cold with the handle of her katana. Poor old Philip then wakes up gagged and tied up with his dick nailed to a wooden board. Yeah, you think that's bad? Well, it gets worse as Michonne proceeds to torture him. First she uses an automatic drill to pierce through his shoulder, then she rips off all his fingernails on one hand with some pliers and then chops off that same arm before cauterizing it to stop the bleeding. Then for the grand finale, she puts a spoon up his arsehole and shovels out God knows what, before them using that same spoon to scoop out one of his eyeballs. I don't even know what to say. The whole thing is like something out of a Saw movie. Again, like in the case of Tyreese killing Chris, you know that the person on the receiving end deserves what's coming to them, but it doesn't make it any easier to take in. The fact that Michonne uses so many different tools just makes it seem like the torture is never going to end, and it's only bested by the next entry on this list. Honestly, I think Kirkman needs his head examined, as I don't know how anyone would come up with this kind of thing. I must admit I feel that Laurie's death on the TV show version of The Walking Dead was handled greatly, and that's not just because I wanted her character to die, well okay it partly is, but it's mostly because it was so unexpected. Laurie died during the 4th episode of season 3, whereas now main characters usually only snuff it during the season openers and finales, Laurie's death came out of the blue. Her comic book counterpart however did not die during childbirth. In fact, she and Judith both made it to the climatic battle against the Governor at the prison. With all hell breaking loose and the prison falling apart under the Governor's assault, Rick tells Carl and Laurie to make a break for it. He, Carl and Laurie, who is holding Judith in her arms, decide to make a run out in the open, which then shockingly leads to Laurie being hit by a bullet which kills both her and Judith, mother and daughter both dead. For me, the sight of seeing a mother attempting to escape to safety with her daughter, only for them both to be killed, tops all the other entries on this list. Not many forms of media have the guts to kill children, especially babies, but The Walking Dead did so, and did it with her father and brother onlooking. Of course, I completely understand why The Walking Dead TV show decided not to kill off Judith. I mean, killing people is one thing, but killing a baby on TV, yeah, that's another thing entirely. Although I understand why Judith is still alive on the TV show, that doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with the decision. As disgusting as it may be, I feel that Judith's death in the comic was the correct decision. Having Rick carry a baby around with him whilst on the road would only invite danger, something that the TV show conveniently decided to ignore. I'm telling you now, as someone who is a new dad, babies cry a hell of a lot, which isn't good when trying to sneak past some walkers. In my mind, Judith doesn't really add anything to the show, and probably won't ever contribute unless the show goes on for another 20 years. Sure, her death would have been brutal, but ultimately it would have made sense. So there you have it, my 5 crazy The Walking Dead comic moments that never made it to TV. Keep your eyes out for part 2, in which I'll cover issue 49 to the beginning of the All Out War arc. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.